everyone. So it's lovely to be here. I'm going to share my screen, and I thought it would be very fun to kind of share in a very engaging way today. So it will be plenty of discussion. I think that's why I was delighted that we were escaping the Zoom presenter mode where you just talk into a void. And this is much better, although the trade-off is we have the doorbell of people wanting to join all the time, but this is really fun. So maybe I'll share. So Cohere for AI, presumably because you're here, you know a little bit about what we do. Today, I'm actually not going to talk as much about what we do as well as much as like the wider spirit of research and maybe the spaces that exist and how you navigate them, as well as, you know, what makes a research question interesting. But a lot of my work has been on areas like efficiency, large language models at scale, safety, hardware-software interaction. And right now, I work a lot on designing large-scale models that are efficient, multilingual, reliable, trustworthy. So I'm happy to talk about this after the talk. I'll hang out for maybe, you know, whoever wants to hang out. Also, no obligation. You can exit afterwards. But today I'm talking about something maybe non-technical, not about these topics. It's not about the work that we do, it's about how we do it and why we choose certain problems. To start with, I'm gonna really share some ideas one I admire really greatly, which is Roseanne Liu, and kind of motivate what we're talking about. But why do we talk about paths into research? So my good friend Roseanne, who leads MLC, describes this: the unreasonable narrow path. And typically, you know, if you want to do research full time, you're kind of forced into this predicament. You either choose academia or industry, and you make a series of choices that have to be done very early on and require choices in your career. So you have to write a paper in your undergrad, then you have to access a top tier program, get in top tier internship, work with the right people, but work with many people, and then having enough papers, having a clear way to describe your research agenda, gain the right role. And this is typical for many famous researchers that we look up to. These are really nice kind of depictions of what has until now been the one path into research. I like to think that that is changing, and I hope that that's changing. I think partly us hosting a session like this is this belief that there's alternate paths and that we can force a third way. Because when we apply this rubric, we kind of end up with the same people. So we just rotate the same group of people between academia and industry. And I think it's worth asking, you know, who made the rubric? Is it in your favor? And what if you don't fit? And so this talk is really about asking how do we fit, how don't we, but also sharing some of the knowledge about the rubric itself, just so when you enter the room, you're aware of what is implicitly being applied. And I think one of the reasons this matters is that it's very hard to time all these steps. So one of my big beliefs is that I think one of the most dynamic parts of the breakthrough that we're currently in is that it kind of opens a door for many people to engage on these ideas. And so in many ways, my grumpy belief is we can have people entering at all these different times, and it doesn't have to be the sequential path. And so I really, one of the reasons to talk about what are the best practices around research is that I think formalization of these practices ends up allocating surplus to a narrow few. So how do we expand discussion to make sure that many are aware of it? And this is particularly important because we're going through a boom in research, so it's just an exciting time. And so it's just interesting to think about. But who produces research remains very narrow. So there's large discrepancies that persist in who participates. It's from the AI Index report. It's not this year's, but last year's, and it shows that only 1% participate from sub-Saharan Africa and only 3% from Latin America and the Caribbean. So I think Madeline is championing this area. I'm just the mere first person, so I hopefully won't lower expectations too much for the rest of the series. But that is the hope, is to demystify the process. And one of the things that I'm proud of with Cohere for AI is that we're this intentionally hybrid lab. And so we're bringing in these new spaces where it's both a full-time industry staff as well as this open science element. And so I think that's part of this, is to have forums like this. With that said, now we're getting ready to get started. So I'm really excited for this hour that we have. I'm going to share some thoughts which are admittedly subjective about how to lead your best life as a researcher, but I want to frame it so I first get sample the wisdom of the crowds. And so I have a series of questions that I love us to think about all together. And to start with, maybe we typically think about research as the finish line of a research project. So these are all projects that were finished last year by the scholars in our program, and that's typically how it's presented, very polished at the end. It often looks like this. You see someone as a poster and you're kind of at the finish line. But there's a huge amount of work that goes into it beforehand. And so it's first starting with what should we work on? How to decide what to work on? Who wants to weigh in?
I think if you don't know what to work on, it is good to work on other people's ideas with them.
Yeah, very nice. So I'm going to say something very interesting, which is that really, if you don't have a strong prior, it's good to just get started. You'll learn something along the way. I tend to really agree with that. There was a lot of enthusiastic versions of follow your heart. So I think that's very eat, pray, love. I think that tends to be good. It depends how there's a balance. I think sometimes it depends on why we like a project. Yeah, we have a few more comments there. Anyone want to chime in as well? Yeah, what else?
Yeah, very happy to be part of the today's session. And by the way, for me, it was very difficult when I started my journey in academia. And after 12 years in industry, I went back to university and started my PhD. By that time, it was really difficult to find a niche because everyone was saying, find a niche, and kind of overwhelms you. And it's pretty okay, even if you don't have one, or even if you don't feel that you don't have a strong point. So if this is the case, probably it's good to go with whatever is offered to you, and along the journey you will find the passion and the interest and you'll grow with it. But in most of the cases, since the whole process of researching and producing some meaningful and impactful research is actually what leads you throughout the whole journey, it's good to go with something that sticks with you. And I've learned that sometimes intentionally or unintentionally, you end up doing whatever was actually with you since the very beginning. And pieces start to get connected together, but you realize that only when you're somehow midway. So, yeah, it sounds like a cliche, but it's probably true when they say that follow your heart or find something that sticks with you and it's close, near, and dear to your heart.
Yeah, there's very interesting points there. I guess there's a few. I find that I personally had chapters in my research career. I completely agree with your observation that very early on, it tends to be valuable just to work on something, especially if it's with people who have more experience than you. And then there's other parts in your career where you're going to have a more distinctive research taste and have an opinion about things that really you're grumpy about, that you really want to change. And there's also just going to be recurring themes where you see similar patterns from, I liked your comment about returning to some of the concepts, because there's going to be as you grow in your research career and encounter more subfields, you do start to see the links and you're able to better bridge some of these concepts. Yeah, what else? Does someone else want to weigh in here? And then I'll share the next. Go for it. Yeah, Andreas, go for it.
I think maybe following your heart is really good for a PhD, but if you are new and you don't have any papers, you don't have any connections, you should think about the marketing. Unfortunately, you have to be discovered, you have to be seen, you have to be kind of popular.
Yeah, maybe Andreas is talking about this part I have it here as part of this unfortunately narrow rubric, which is here, have a clear, easy to describe research agenda. There is a balance, I think, and maybe I'll switch to you sharing some of the first thoughts, is that I do think it benefits to go deep initially rather than wide on your first topic. Afterwards, it benefits to go wide. I think that typically, in my mind, and this is distinctive for everyone, I did promise that this would be a subjective talk, but I think that going deep initially gives you command over a certain area, but it also allows you to communicate your perspective easily. But it's important as well because you typically end up showing end-to-end execution, which is important. If you go wide, sometimes you have a lot of partial projects, but you don't complete any. But after that, once you've mastered a subfield, it can be quite powerful to go wide and to sample and to bridge some of these ideas. So I do agree with Andreas's perspective that sometimes it's easy to communicate what you've done if you focused on an area early on and you've shown this end-to-end mastery. I do think one of the most important things, I do agree with one of the first comments that were made, is that you may not have a good sense of what your research interests are, or there may be many that are equally appealing, especially when you start out. It's much more important to just work with someone who is better than you. It's the biggest accelerant, frankly. And so if you don't have a strong pull to a certain topic, or you don't have enough domain expertise in a certain topic, I would always opt for working with someone who's really good. And then I would say one of my main recommendations is, even as you mature as a researcher, don't become too attached to specific domains or techniques. I know there are researchers here who will disagree, who are Bayesians through and through, and this is what they want to do. But I think that something to just think about is that you want to work on problems, not settings. And so I think that's really important in terms of the longevity of your research career, is that if we look at the last few years, it's changed so much, like machine translation as a separate subfield versus NLP, and even the shift of resources from computer vision to NLP to now multimodal. I think it makes a lot of sense to have a philosophy of like what your taste in problems rather than very specific settings. But I'd welcome any other thoughts here as on what you should work on, anything that resonated. Oh, Kimball asked, what's the difference between being interested and being attached? I'm not sure I quite followed that question. So typically when I see attachment patterns, it's when someone's worked on something for quite a long time, sometimes you see them getting attached to that subfield because they put a lot of time in. Attachment can be good or bad. It depends on the inflection point. Attachment's often very good when you're in your first project and you persevere to get the problem working. Jonathan Frankel's lottery ticket paper is a good example of that. His advisor didn't think it would work. He just kept on going, refused to shelve the project, and it turned out to be an interesting paper. And in some ways to have kind of a very interesting perspective. So becoming attached to a problem, being stubborn about a problem can help if you're trying to drive through that period of a project where everyone knows the results, are not quite working. You could either fold or you could keep going. Attachment is more dangerous if you become attached to a certain way of thinking about you only like to work on this specific domain, or you don't want to work on, a wider set of problems, or you just want to become attached to pivoting your technique to many different settings. I think that's a bit more problematic attachment, and it's a balance. Like even attachment in the first sense of just pushing through obstacles, at some point you kind of have to call it with a project. And so one of the biggest transitions from an inexperienced researcher to an experienced is getting a better sense of call it. Yeah. What else? Any other thoughts here? I'm going to move to this one. How do we find collaborators, mentors? Kyle's asking, well, I'm very interested in hearing more thoughts about crawling in. Yeah, I can share some more thoughts. Maybe maybe we can do that. Oh, Mohammed, straight to the point. Would you like to become my mentor? Nice, Mohammed, go for it. This is exactly the spirit. Yeah. So maybe I will. Okay, so Kimbo says I personally cold email a lot. Not sure if it's the best way though. Cold emailing is very good. Researchers actually, you'd be surprised, they don't get a ton of emails. But here's the important piece. It has to be tailored and it has to actually be meaningful, because it's very obvious when it's not, and it actually works against you, because the research community is much smaller than you think. Often when you're starting, you think it's massive, but it's not. You'll see all these people repeatedly at conferences over the course of your career. So spend some care. Don't go for volume. Spend some time emailing people thoughtfully. What makes it feel good? Yeah, Ibrahim, go for it. Yeah.
From my experience, one of the things that worked better for me, more than cold emailing, is joining conferences, something like virtual ACL or something like that. If you can't make it to the like the on-site conference, and there was these like virtual town halls type of thing that you can approach people and talk. So basically, I made a list of like people whose work I always, like I was interested in, and just told them a little bit about my background and offering my time if there is a project that, in their lab that I can contribute to or something like this. This worked well for me, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think what was crucial about that was that you had a action follow-up that was quite clear. You went into the conversations being like, hey, I would love if there's a project that fits, I would love to collaborate. I actually think that's another crucial aspect of a cold email, or if you happen to do a virtual conference, that's also a virtual conferences. Personally, I think have been kind of mixed bag in terms of richness of interaction. But I will say it's much more likely to succeed if you have this actionable ask at the end. And one of the ways is by specifically saying, hey, I'm interested in collaborating with you. If you have any backburner projects or anything that you're planning to work on, we should chat. Yeah, nice. So yeah, I was a really big one of how we work with a lot of people. Yeah, Marjana, go for it.
I'll share my experience coming from a developing country. It was always a struggle. It is even now, as I speak, to get involved into research, proper research, especially because we lack research labs in the higher education system due to funding problems. And for me, it has always been a good recipe, that of first identifying communities or associations or groups that are related to computer science, where I can offer my help or my contribution for free as a volunteer. That has been a way to show to these communities that you're worth it, and then eventually new opportunities will be offered to you. The second way to identify potential mentors and peers and collaborators has been that of identifying summer schools. And there are a bunch of summer schools that offer and also fund you. And they are the perfect place to be, where you can not only learn, but also extend your networking capabilities, and good things come out of it. And absolutely, these virtual communities that sometimes turn out to be really proficient.
Yeah, this is great. Yeah, and then I'll just say this has come up in a few comments. So it sounds like Kyle we're start collaborating through Luth AI. I am Masakani. So I do agree. The biggest indicator, we've hired a lot of full-time staff from like some of our open source collaborations, and it just offers a chance for you to also just gain experience. Ritikesh, do you want to chat? Say something?
Yeah, so to find collaborators and mentors, usually during my college days, my friends and people who I was comfortable with and I knew like they had some sort of knowledge, maybe not specifically in the domain, but the main priority that I looked for was people who I was comfortable working with, talking generally, sharing ideas, and not just hesitating about anything. But yeah, mentors during college, I like reached out to my professors. But after that, while like I'm working right now in a company, so that is a bit different right now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah, I agree. I think it's also something where you don't overthink. That's actually the first suggestion I have. I have a suggestion that everyone should send an email once a month to an author you admire. Remember that things can either be building relationships that are action oriented, like Ibrahim was talking about, I want to collaborate on a project, or they can just be building a collection of relationships where you actually admire this person, which is probably the preferable, authentic way. I have to admit, I'm not particularly good at networking, but I've always felt like it's more authentic to me if I'm sending an email to someone I actually really like their work and really care about. And so I tend to do this because also this feels more meaningful and it feels quite authentic. I would also say one of the biggest suggestions I have is to share as you ask. And so I think, for example, Mohammed, would you like to become my mentor? I think that this resonates also if you show me what you've worked on, and it's very clear that there's an affinity there. So Andreas is actually, or some of your early blogs were just excellent, and some of your expositions of work, and I remember them still. And so this is a really important thing, that if you write technical blog posts or you share work as you go, and it doesn't have to be fully polished, people will find you. And then I would say realize that collaborators don't just have to be senior or junior. So you can find peers and start collaboration and bring a mentor in after some experiments. So typically, because I'll just speak for myself, I get a lot of inbound asking, do people want to participate or be part of research projects? It's very helpful if some initial work has been done and I can see the serious intent, because typically the biggest obstacle to overcome with cross-institutional collaborations is just inertia, people not being organized in a way that the project's moving. So I think that's also, Aloof AI is a good example of that. I think a lot of the work is kind of very diffuse until critical mass forms, and then it accelerates very quickly. So, and I would say Aya is also a good example of that. There was as much peer-to-peer collaboration as there was like mentor-mentee collaboration. And then having a clear sense. So this is really critical, is to get input in a paper. So I often get emailed to ask for input on a paper. That's actually a very easy ask because I can read it through. That's more time scoped, and typically that's also very meaningful. Even if I, often it's not even for authorship because the paper is very polished at that point. But it's just a meaningful way to connect with fellow researchers, and it's a way for you to share your work before you release it, to stress test an idea, to help navigate a difficult situation. And then I would also suggest to pay it forward. So I think this is another part which is really important, which is that we tend to put ourselves in the dynamic of student only, teacher only, but we are really one thing. And so you typically are both a collaborator as well as you have the chance to be that mentor for someone else. Yeah, any other thoughts here? And I'll also introduce this question. Yeah, and people feel free to answer to either, but what makes a scientific question interesting? So how to decide if you're working on something meaningful? Oh, Rabia said, why should a mentor say yes? I mean, they already have PhDs and assistants. I actually think, so mentors are not just professors or lab leads. I think there's a lot of mentors who are actually PhD students. I wouldn't underestimate bringing an idea to a PhD student and saying, I want to work on this. I would say a mentor typically will not say yes unless you have a clear way of saying, hey, I'm excited about your work. Can you let me know about the next project you need help on? So that's a very clear ask and it's a low lift, or you proposing exactly what your idea is. And then it's more clear if the mentor is aligned or not. I think the hardest things to say yes to when it's just an imprecise ask for mentorship. But yeah, so we have a few responses here. So novelty impact, but what do we mean by that? I mean, how do we know if our work is novel other than using the word novel in our abstract, which is a bit overused? Yeah. Yeah, what, how do we know if we're actually, this is so much work, it takes so much work to do research. How do we know if we're actually doing something meaningful? Are we doing something meaningful? I mean, it's also fair to frame it like that. Who wants to share? Bravery. Are we all uncertain that we are even doing something that matters? So, okay, so Rohan says, I don't think anyone does and correlate to market problems. Okay, what do we mean by market problems? Yeah, Ibrahim says, use case for work, African NLP, so we can see the downstream real world impact. Yeah, I agree. I think that this type of work actually doesn't really have an incentive structure that's valued enough within research, but there are tangible problems where it really has a massive real world impact and you can see when it improves. I would actually say more and more research. Yeah, Bharat, go for it.
Yes, I'm not yet 2 papers in, but this is something that I think about a lot. I think one thing that I do is coming back to your first point, was lean on collaborators and mentors to guide me on some of these things. The second thing that I think about a lot is, am I excited and am I having fun? I think that's important, because if you're not having fun, I think it's not worth doing. And the third thing is, what sort of impact do you think, or do your mentors and collaborators think it'll have? Is it going to answer questions? Is it going to be something that people in the community are going to use? Is it going to make an interesting paper? Those are the things that I'm right now thinking about, but like I said, caveated that I'm not yet 2 papers in, so.
Yeah, no, that was excellent. I do think the barometer of are you enjoying the problem is really important, because frankly, research takes too much work to not find what you're doing interesting. It becomes very hard otherwise. Yeah, Teju says something meaningful is subjective. Could be a gap that you discover that would like to close. Yep, so it could be something that you're particularly grumpy that doesn't exist, that there's not coverage for. Yeah, I think a lot of people are resonating with that idea, Cal, as well. And okay, Andreas, go for it. What do you mean by this? Some projects might be meaningful for the career. Is this back to the marketing?
I mean, I don't, if you're talking meaningful for applications of science, I think there are plenty of research directions where you can have a very fruitful research career and it not being meaningful. But it's meaningful for the career. It's meaningful for publishing papers, meaningful for getting grants. And like, as you said, for example, like the African NLP, right? Like, it's not that helpful for the career, but it is very like meaningful work in other sense.
Yeah.
So meaningful here is a bit broad. It's not a criticism, but I think perhaps that's the reason why we might have different opinions amongst those participating.
Yeah, Ian, go for it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So just in my background doing medical research in the US, the funding bodies like the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health are frequently the arbiters of what kind of meaningful work actually gets done, gets out of researchers' heads.
Yeah, so what we're getting into is this idea of, what are the metrics that we actually measure progress by? And so, number of papers or grants funding, and that might be different from what is actually meaningful science. So there's a tension there. Yeah, Christos, go for it.
That's it, exactly. So basically, I saw a few people that raised the citation part as a metric, or maybe the number of papers as a metric. I mean, I'm not as senior as some of the people in the call, but I think I am 2 papers in. So I would say that more towards what you like, more towards what you think will lead to an interesting application, further down, less towards I need to improve this metric by 1%. and carry the torch from the previous person that improved it by 2%. And citations, sometimes they're like the wind. So if you work in the space of LLMs, and you do something that improves somehow the performance of a core model, it may or may not become very popular, but often it has been the case that people worked on things that they found interesting, and 2, 3, 4 years down the line, suddenly other people in the community discovered that work, and it grew up in citations out of nowhere. And there's a lot of examples of that. So I would say, don't worry as much about getting as many citations as you want immediately. I've seen people that I've mentored worry about putting their paper out, and then they're like, oh, we're 2 years in and I only got 1 citation. This other person from Stanford got 1,000 citations before they even finished their PhD, therefore I should drop out. You know, don't measure your impact with H indexes and citations. Use multiple metrics.
Yeah. Oh, nice. That got applause, Kostas. Nice. I think there's some things that resonated there that I also had. Most importantly, not be about incremental improvements. Or if you do really care about incremental improvements, make sure that the benchmark is measuring what you really want it to measure and it's a meaningful jump. I also think, personally, I don't really like working on a small pivot of an existing idea. I think this tends to be incentivized poorly by metrics like, Ian's getting at this, but like grants and things like that tend to really favor pivots. But it's, I always try and ask, like, would this idea be done by someone else, or does it have to be done by me once I've put the first idea out there? I also think that you should always have a view of the wider field in mind. So why does this question matter beyond a single paper, and why should we care? A lot of people have said it has to be something you care about. I completely agree with that. I think it's just, when you're working on an idea at the frontier, so many things are going to go wrong that you need to care about the problem. And then I also think one of my suggestions is that you need to balance your collaborators. You need some collaborators who are the grumpy ones, who are going to be critical and kind of say stress testing every part. But you also need someone who's bought into the idea from the beginning. Otherwise, if you have too many cynical people, you're kind of, it's not a viable idea in the long run. I'll just be candid. So you need buy-in, and you need at least someone who cares deeply about the idea, but you should complement with someone who's a very good cynic, who's going to stress test the idea in every way. Yeah. Anything else here? I do think that, like, as a realist, as we think about those two paths, to industry and into research, you do have to balance the formal rubric, which is paper acceptances, citations, with making sure that you're preserving why you entered research. So I would never say, I don't know if I'm as bullish as Kostas that, 1 citation over 2 years. The truth is, the reality is that these things will matter if you go into industry or into academia down the road, but you need to preserve your sense of self. Like, that can't get lost along the way. Otherwise, I think, frankly, why do it? There's more lucrative ways to make money without, you can easily go work in finance, frankly, and make a lot of money. So you have to preserve some sense of soul and kind of liking the questions that you're working on. So Kyle says, why work on directions you're not excited about? I think that there's definitely been papers I've done in my career that I was not excited about, but I felt necessary. I don't know how to, maybe I'll give a concrete example. So we did what is papers I'm most proud of, which is this, what does a compressed deep neural network forget? And at the time, everyone said, like, why does this matter? Like, all you're articulating, and actually the insights were super fascinating, basically showing them the majority of capacity is used to learn this long tail, like these rare artifacts. But everyone really said kind of, oh, is this interesting? Is this important? Now there's a lot of recognition for that paper, which is quite meaningful. But at the time, I felt the need to articulate it in framing that people would understand. So I did a secondary paper explicitly showing how this amplified really, but problematic properties in the long tail, like fairness. And I had to admit that paper felt like I was really trying to just get through it because I felt like it was necessary to establish like why this was important, but I was quite grumpy doing it because I felt like I had already said it. So there's papers like that. And I think every researcher will say they've done a paper like that. Maybe someone will say they haven't. Please do. But it can't dominate your research portfolio. I think that would be my recommendation. Ife says, yes, if you don't have benchmarks in current soda. So I think that, frankly, so Ife saying, well, if you don't have benchmarks or current soda, you won't get accepted into a conference. Frankly, I've started saying we should question benchmarks that don't make sense. So recently we released a model, Command.Plus, and we benchmarked on the OpenLLM leaderboard, but it was super disheartening. I just felt really annoyed by it. So at the time when we released, we were the top of the leaderboard within our category of models, but I actually was like, I don't think we should even share this because this leaderboard, it's still got hella swag and it's measuring things that we know are just very academic benchmarks that don't really capture all the things we want these models to do. And we ended up waiting for the chatbot arena results because I think that's a better proxy right now of actual quality that can't be gamed and that actually is a meaningful indicator of quality. So I've increasingly said it's okay to take a position about what benchmarks matter, probably not for your first paper. So I understand your perspective, Ife, where you're like, okay, I've done this work, I need to prove this according to these benchmarks. But increasingly, I'm forming the opinion that we should be explicit when benchmarks are bad, and we just shouldn't play that game. But maybe other people have different ideas. I agree it's easier for me to say than maybe it is when you're doing your first paper. Okay. What else? Any other thoughts here on what makes a scientific question interesting? I have this. So what are best practices for your research projects? I'll share some of mine, and then I would love to seed it with what other people. So my first one kind of echoes what I said earlier. I think it's better. Oh, Karthik, go for it. Yeah, why don't you kick off?
Yeah, I think the best practices would be doing the best literature survey. So breaking down your idea into components that really matters, and then seeing forward what are the latest literature, the researches that has been done in particularly those components, and then figuring out what improvement you're exactly trying to bring out when combining all these components. So when combining all these literature surveys that you acquired.
I think this is a great idea. I actually have this here as one of the tips is I would suggest whenever you get started on a topic, become the domain expert on the research scope. So you're going to have an initial set of hypotheses, spend 2 to 3 weeks, so cover the related work, data sets, and baselines, and then shelve it. So I always say don't spend too long in the literature review, don't get derailed by any other papers that come out, but know your domain inside and out, especially baselines. So the biggest feature of a strong researcher for me who's starting out is someone who knows the baselines, who can reference, oh, this is how that technique compared on this baseline. This is why I think we should do that baseline. And having that level of rigor, I typically make a spreadsheet, actually, if I'm trying to command a whole new subfield. And then I'll just write, what data sets do they benchmark on? And I'll reference it repeatedly, even in meetings, just to make sure that I'm calibrated on, are we comparing fairly? What are the details? Having a command like that makes you stand out really early on. But I also pair it with this, which is remember not to get especially with our field moving so quickly. What I've noticed is some researchers get paralysis when a new paper comes out. So I always say bound this time. Spend 3 weeks stress testing your scope and then shelve it and you're on to experiments. And you should say, if I've stress tested and I feel good about the scope, I'm just going to go for it. And unless it's something major and close that comes up, stay in that sequence of just doing. Yeah, that's really nice. What else? Do other people have ideas? The other, stress testing. So I actually typically do this as a group activity. So within the lab, I'll ask a few people to tell me why my idea doesn't work. And I do it early on because then there's no pride. So if they tell me they don't like it, if they tell me it doesn't work, I'm not so far in that I feel like, oh, I have to prove it worked. So do it very early and just write up a 1-page doc. And you ask people, please tear this to pieces, like find the areas where this won't work, where this is not an interesting idea. And actually, typically within our lab, we do a whole session about stress testing each proposal. Okay, a few other ideas here. I definitely recommend to communicate both failures and successes. I think often when people are starting out, they forget this, but it builds a lot of trust in a research collaboration. It means that I frankly don't care if experiments don't work, but it builds trust when you share how they didn't work, and also where it's part of failing fast. So like if a hypothesis doesn't work, we learn from it and we go to the next one. It's very hard if there's only partial and successful or rosy views of the data shared. It's much more damaging from research than just saying for a few weeks, oh, we're nowhere. I think that's way, way better. And also when we're moving and nowhere, but we can see experiments failing in different ways, it often tells you a lot. So it's actually very good progress. And then I would also say, engineering skills matter a lot. You're going to iterate a lot faster, so don't underinvest there. You're going to have a lot more control of your experiments and going to be able to try more things. Yeah, what else here? What do people think?
Sarah, I had like a kind of like separate question. Can I bring it up or?
Wow, a rogue question. Okay, why don't you put it in the chat? Because I think, did someone else put their hand up? I just want to make sure we have enough time for the...
Yeah, I do also have a question. Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, then we can do questions. Yeah, what are the questions?
Can I just go first because I'm driving to office and I need to get off. So I am like I'm an ML engineer, right? And I'm working in the applied ML space, essentially building around all of these models. And I imagine by the nature of these LLMs, there's just going to be a lot more people building around them than like training these models. But if someone wants to, who is like, and I've noticed in my career, like I'm moving more and more towards the applied side. If someone wants to go from like, like an applied ML kind of job to like a more researcher and doing more foundational research, how does one pivot to that? How does one go about it? And because like I have found that very hard to do. Like I'm just being pushed more and more into like applied work and all that. And as you just mentioned, right, like engineering skills are important. So I feel like, someone is in applied ML, then if they do foundational research, they will like bring their own flavor and some value.
Yeah,
So,
maybe I'll share some quick thoughts, and then we can also open up at the end. I know it sounds like you have to hop into work, but I'll also stay a bit at the end and we can do... Oh, nice. And I'm glad someone else is answering this, it sounds like. Okay, so one thing I'll say is I think that open communities are the best way. So typically to make the pivot, for most research engineering roles, it's both showing evidence that you can do research as well as showing strong engineering skills. You already have strong engineering skills, which is part of it. And then I would just show 1 to 2 examples of your ability to collaborate in research projects. I know that sounds a bit circular because then you have to do research before you get the research position, but frankly, I think that's a reality given the competitiveness of the talent pool. And so a lot of the suggestions that came up, for example, from Kyle, where he was talking about Luther AI, or even from reaching out to, it sounds like you are in a research-focused company. Even if you're working more in production, you can reach out to researchers who are working on the more intrinsic questions and ask to collaborate. I think Michael's idea is also good. We implement research papers. And I would suggest writing a technical blog post afterwards. But if you can point to enough of these artifacts, then that's already a strong portfolio. So yes, the other thing I wanted to say here is on honestly, I would say for research meetings or when you're in a research project, even if you don't have anything, and by the way, I would recommend it's totally okay some weeks to have no progress and to say none of the experiments work. I think we're in the same place. I would just show or present some of the questions you want to go through. So the worst thing you can do is cancel a meeting if you have nothing. I think just to build trust within a research collaboration, it's always better to just lead through code or just say, these are what I'm thinking about, and just get pushed through that discomfort of feeling like, oh, I don't have anything, so I don't want to present. Because it's one of the ways of building trust in a relationship. To be honest, a lot of research is trust. It's like you're exploring the unknown, and so you need to, kind of have the emphasis on the idea. And so a lot of it's like realizing that we're all in this together, and when it's a failure, it's not a failure on one person, it's just a natural part of the project, and presenting each time just helps with that, I think. Even though it sounds silly, but it helps just get everyone comfortable with the idea that nothing happened this week, none of the experiments worked, that's okay, we're going on to next week. And I would also say, I mentioned this before, but complete experiments. This brings me to this question. So how do you preserve your sense of self when experiencing failure? What do you recommend for researchers who haven't experienced failure yet? I think the second question is just as important. Ibrahim tears. Nice, it's an appropriate emoji, yes. Yeah, what do people think? Any thoughts here? Has everyone else just accepted failure?
One thing from my perspective is when I try something like a direction or an experiment and it doesn't work, I mean, it's frustrating, but I find some comfort, at least that I can like strike out this direction. At least this doesn't work. This narrows the path a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. A brutal rejections, failures. I think it can feel that way. For me, the most brutal failures are the ones where you feel like it's so close, like your paper is really on the borderline, you really believe in the work, so it's not that you just rushed it and then it just doesn't fall your way with one reviewer, and then you push so hard through the whole rebuttal process and then still the AC doesn't go your way. Those are really tough. I still feel those. I felt through. I feel like everyone who's done a lot of papers, the beautiful thing is, pick any famous researcher you want and you can go to Open Review and see how many failed papers that they have, and we all have a ton. So we all fail a lot, and I think over time it feels less painful, so you get more used to it. But yeah, I do think there's some things that have helped, I think, for me thinking about failure. One is to teach while I learn. I think that research rewards are quite sparse. It takes a while to do a paper, and then you have to submit the paper, get the approved, rejection or the resubmit, or you get the acceptance full time. Give short talks. I think these are useful ways in which you have a more rich reward landscape. And then I would say set up coffee chats that are not your immediate collaborators. So typically, if you're solely focused on your research project and your only contact points are your immediate collaborators, sometimes it feels a bit intense. You don't have any other break or to think about meaning in different ways. What else? Any other ideas here?
Maybe when you have collaborators who are much more experienced, they tend to not have so much an emotional reaction. And I think in the beginning that can feel quite invalidating. And I think it's important to realize it's not actually invalidating. It's more of something for you to try and learn to mirror.
Yeah.
I also think that it kind of happens. It feels worse especially when we're kind of attached to the idea.
Yeah.
And we think that, oh, we really wanted it to work and it didn't. And in those times, if like my manager actually helped me with this, and he told me, hey, it's kind of okay, but the important thing is after you realize that this didn't work and you accept it, you need to keep your ball on the problem. And as long as your compass is pointed towards solving the problem, you'll be okay, and you can, get over that failure.
Yeah, I really like that. By the way, that's one of the reasons I do stress testing at the beginning, because I do like grumpy researchers tearing my idea to parts. Like, I think it's got a useful function. It's really, but I want it at a time in the project where I don't feel so bored in that it is emotional as a process, and that I'm more distant from the idea, and it can be treated as an idea, as separate. And I think that's also a useful way. I would recommend it for others, is that it's helpful if you do it early, but invite the most grumpy person you know, because then you're not so attached. You can incorporate the feedback, and then they're actually bought into your idea. Because no matter what, if a grumpy researcher takes the time to give feedback on your idea, it's probably because some element of the idea interests them. And so what you'll find is they'll be very bought into the idea that they're very grumpy about. So there's interesting dynamics like that. But another thing, Nikhil, that you said that I really would reemphasize is that the iteration cycle and just learning from the experiments that don't work is a very crucial part of research. And one of the biggest lessons for successful researchers is not to get emotionally attached to the outcome as personal to them, but as a shared idea that you're iterating on and stress testing, essentially. I think I also like to frame it as that. Yeah, I think Michael's saying, yeah. So Kartik asks, how do you conduct stress testing? So we do in a few ways. Like if someone from the lab has an idea, they write up a proposal, and then we stress test it early on. So we add comments async, because that tends to also allow the person to parse the comments and, digest them. It's not like we're all in a room just being like, it also forces, and I think this is good, it forces all the researchers to read the idea rather than just doing like off the hand comments. So I think this is useful, because then people actually read and they have to give better formed feedback. And then after that, we'll do an in-person, but by that point it's been through one round and everyone's kind of bored in because they had to give one round of feedback. And so and we never reject an idea. It's more like just what ideas are ready at a given time. So an idea can always be a backburner idea. And typically once a person decides to write it up, the effort of writing it up is in effect a threshold, right? By writing it up, you're selecting the best idea because it takes a bit of effort. So I think I tend to find it useful. Yeah, how do other people do stress testing? I'm sure everyone has their own formats. We are also at time, but I'm happy to stay. I'm happy to stay another 15 to 20 minutes to also have a more free-form discussion like we've been having. But I'm curious, like, how do other people do stress testing if someone wants to share? Or people can switch to this. And what's one thing you wish you'd known before you attended a conference? Kartik, go for it.
Yeah, for me, it's basically I go to the best person who critiques me and explain them this idea. And they initially find out all the negative aspects of that idea to explain it to me.
Yeah. But I think that's great early on, because you anticipate your worst criticizer very early on in the process. So yeah. Don says other concrete sections. Actually, Madeline can share an example. We made it available in the community. It's supposed to be very minimal. So it's supposed to be, 1.5 pages. Just, why does this question matter? Yeah, Vin, go for it.
I think one thing I've done is I generally keep a very low-key social media profile. But if I have any ideas, you can just post it from anonymous Twitter accounts and CCing like a couple of folks who are like super interested in research, and you can do both the pros, like the actual idea, and the complete, like, let's say the opposite spectrum of the idea, and you'll find so many people have so much time to actually critique it right there. And I get so much, like, it's not just a research idea. I get like so much information just by doing that. So yeah, I just thought I would share this trick. It has worked really well for me.
This is such a fabulous suggestion. I'm so intrigued. Yeah, this is so funny. Yeah, I do like that. And I do like the idea of anonymously, because sometimes I've found, yeah, I think you can influence, depending on who posts, it can influence a lot how people respond. So yeah, that's actually fantastic. Okay, yeah, on either question, you know, about conferences or stress testing, yeah, anyone else want to share? Yeah, maybe I'll share about conferences and then we can open up and just I'd love to hear, we can do questions or just general. One thing about conferences, I'll just share my perspective. I tend to prefer like more structured interactions. I just enjoy it. I don't know, it's maybe my energy level. So I really like it when people reach out asking for coffee, oddly enough. It's kind of nice because then you have an actual deeper conversation. You can talk about research, and I'll often reach out before conference to schedule coffee. And so a lot of conferences, I'll do kind of coffees with different people. So don't feel that you have to network in a totally unstructured way. If you prefer more one-to-one interaction, that's definitely something I recommend. Poster sessions are the best part for me. I actually don't attend talks. It's just not the way I learn. Like, I'm a text-based learner. I've often read a lot of the papers by the time I get to the conference. So you'll rarely find me hearing even the keynotes and the tutorials. It's just not the way that I'd like to digest knowledge. So I tend to really restrict to post sessions, and I do a lot of coffees. And then I would again say connect in a way authentic to you. So I like small dinners. I think that's really fun while in Europe's. And then you also don't have to talk about research. So I think I often find people who are very new to research and they want to come and talk to me, and they just jump into like their whole paper. And you can do that. I think that's it's always natural to find affinity and to want to talk about ideas, but you can also not. So it's also okay. Yeah, Teju's like, yeah, don't do everything. This is not, not designed for you to attend everything. What else? Any other suggestions here that people have for attending ML conferences? Oh yeah, I just had a difference. Some people who are not aware. So there'll be workshops on main track, and so there'll be different acceptance rates for both. So if you're starting out, you may want to submit to a workshop. It's where you share a preliminary version of the work, and then main tracks are much more competitive. So they have the more rigorous acceptance rates. Okay, do we want to do this one, or should we just open up to questions? What's the sentiment? Yeah, this one might be relevant for a lot of people. We will have a panel on this. I think Madeline's organizing. Maybe I'll just share what I wrote, and then we can just do open questions. Yeah, so I would say, again, communication matters. So some professors may not even have spots, so you should check in advance. And then your biggest calling card is who you've worked with and how they speak about you. I'll just be super honest about this. It really matters. So again, don't go for breadth of collaborations. You should just go for a few collaborations where people are really going to speak super highly about you. And then references matter a lot. So again, I would try and find collaborations proactively with researchers who are already in the field. And this gets to Andreas's point at the beginning. I do agree, you know, Andreas calls it marketing, but it really does matter how you speak about your work. You want to speak about it in a big picture way, not only in terms of what you did, but why it matters. So don't get boxed into a specific task you previously looked at. Think about the core questions and how do you communicate in an accessible way. Oh, wow, I continued. Okay, wow. For internships, 3 months is short. So here you'll typically work on someone else's idea. So you should make sure you care about it and figure out if you're excited about the project. And for PhD programs, you have to speak to students. And the community is small. So you're going to bump into these people again and again. So there will be repeat interactions. So treat people with grace and courtesy, even if you're rejecting a program. Reject it in a way that, you know, knowing that you're going to bump into these professors again. So yeah, okay, what should we talk about? You know, what are questions on people's minds? Okay, Kyle, go for it. Nice. I like that.
Certainly, and thanks so much, Sarah and all the other folks for putting this on. Sharing all this tacit knowledge is super valuable. I think I want to hear a bit more about the kind of like when to pivot and when to call a project. So my first two projects I've gotten involved with research ended up lasting over a year and having lots of ups and downs. And while I feel proud of the outcomes, I'm not totally sure if it was the most wise move overall to try to persevere that whole time. And I even got some advice to halt from my collaborators, but pivoted persevered anyways. Is there like a good rule of thumb or experiences you have of when's a good time to, I don't know, call a project? Especially if it's maybe in that middle ground where you have some results and they're like kind of okay. So it's not like a total failure, but not like a wild success.
Yeah, so I would say, I guess my philosophy has been typically any question that you ask is going to have one core hypothesis, and you want to get to that hypothesis as quickly as possible. Maybe I'll share an example. What project should I use? Variance of gradients is a good project. So we were looking at training signal across training. And so it was like looking at whether the variance with respect to the gradients of an input could be a good discriminator of example difficulty. And so there's a few factors there. So one is understanding the role of data set. Does it generalize across data sets? The other is understanding the role of scale. Like, does it generalize at different levels? We started very small with, this was a computer vision setting. So we actually started with CFAR 10, which seems like a lifetime ago. But yeah, we ran it there. So typically that's how you start a project. And do you see success there? If you don't, it may be because of confounding factors. Like, is it because the data set's too simple? Or is it because you're not using checkpoints across training? What I would suggest is, I love how Michael's like, yeah, let me remind people what CFAR 10 is. Nice, thanks, Michael. What I would suggest is, at that inflection point where you get your first negative results, you want to choose levers that will actually make a difference. And so, for example, using the same data set, small tweaks to the experiment is probably not as useful at that point if you see negative results as just changing the data set entirely, or, for example, choosing a larger scale architecture. So that's what I would suggest, is fail quickly. The other thing to do is choose extreme variance. We're doing this right now with a project where it's much more interesting if we change 10% and 90% of something. So at the extremes, we're changing a lot rather than doing 10%, 20%, 30%, 50%. So you don't have to run all ablations. You should run the most extreme where you expect to see the most difference. So let's say you do all that and it's still murky or still fails. You have to ask yourself, is this just a murky question where I'm going to get mixed results? And if so, is it interesting to me? And maybe you just write it up as a technical blog post, or is it something where you see some lever to disentangle the results? That's where I think it's important to make the call, because some problems you just end up with murky results. That's the truth. There's just not enough signal there, or it will take a lot more compute to figure out the signal. And that's where I say, make the call. Do you want to shelve this? Do you want to package it as a blog post? Or do you want to persevere? Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Kostas, do you want to say something about that? I think it's a really important aspect of failing quickly.
It goes along with everything that you mentioned earlier, Sara. For example, having good engineering, it feeds into failing quickly, because if you have very good engineering skills, you'll be able quickly to create examples of realistic size. You don't have to go to your whole training data set immediately, and then see what works and then plan from there, instead of trying directly to hit the goal and then being disappointed that you cannot hit it for various reasons. So yeah, failing, but not in terms of like failure as rejection, but failure as learning. You can only learn if you fail. If you're always succeeding, you're not learning anything. You don't get any signal from new signal from repeated success.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, what else? What other questions? So Drew asks, how do you organize your time as a research daily task and across a research project? It's going to vary a lot depending on, where you are in your research career. If you're the first author in a paper, I would say that you're probably going to be spending the bulk of your time. There's going to be stages. There's going to be the stage where you orientate the scope, but there's probably going to be a lot of time spent running experiments where you're iterating on your hypotheses. Much of our research right now is fairly compute intensive, so it's going to be a healthy amount of engineering time. Do other people have thoughts here? Otherwise, we can open up for more questions. Yeah, what else? Can we rely on the latest AI search tools to accelerate related research? I don't know. I have been playing with using some tools like Command R+. I was playing with the other day to see how it would. Actually, Virat had this experience as well. He's preparing a summary. He's presenting a work, so he was using it to iterate. I do think it helps sometimes with creating a base text that you then tear to pieces because you're not happy with. But sometimes that's useful, to have a foil to work against. So I do think that's very interesting specific specialized search, which is looking at citations. And I think that could be fun. If you can, right now citations is super kind of painful. Typically I go to a paper that I think is important for my paper, and then I just go through all the papers that have cited it, and then I start building up by going through the citation hierarchy, what I think should be included. But everyone has different styles, but I do think it's kind of interesting there. How many projects can a full-time researcher work on at the first time? How to avoid? I would say if you're first author, I would say 2. That feels, if you're truly a first author and if you're having a perspective, but other people can weigh in. I think that, Virat is saying that AI tools help to articulate. I do find it helps to speed up some of the, just thinking about how to have a draft. Well, I would say, so going back, I kind of switched between 2 questions there, but yeah, for those of you, for first author roles, how many projects do people think you can do at the same time? I think above 2 would be tricky, but I have seen first authors be first author in 2 and then be third author in a third, and that can be a nice mental switch. So it can be beneficial for people to be part of a third project in a different role because it can give you a break from maybe being in the weeds on your project. So that's something I have seen work. What do other people think? What's the limits? Andreas looks like he wants to weigh in. Yeah, I thought so.
I mean, I think you can only focus on one at a time.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine doing more than one. But there will be some overlap at some point, right? Because then the paper gets rejected and you need to change something and you already started working on the other one. So, I mean, recently I did 3 papers. I got rebuttals for them all in the same week. It was horrible.
Yeah.
Right. You cannot respond to that many reviewers in 1 week. So I don't recommend that.
Yeah, I do agree. I think even 2 is a lot if you're the first author, just because there's so many details you're going to be keeping track of. Drew posted some questions from earlier. How important is showcasing collaborative ability when seeking out internships or moving to research? Collaborative ability in the sense of work that's done collaboratively. I mean, I would say very important, but it's probably more important that you're shown to be a true collaborator. So for example, if you're fourth on a paper and it's not really clear how it relates to your research interests, that's much less interesting than if you have even just a technical blog post where you're showing a clear opinion and you've done all the work, and that's super interesting. That's always going to have more of a say because it's showing me also your research perspective and what you care about. But yes, having a few collaborations where you've clearly played an active role and you've been a meaningful part of it is valuable. Yeah, what do other people think here? How does research implemented individually match up? So in computer science, we typically have a lot of authors per paper, somewhat different from other fields. Some fields like mathematics, it's very rare to have a lot of co-authors. law, it's very rare to have a lot of co-authors. That typically is because we have a lot more, our experimental setup is a lot more complex. It's also just, I guess, a facet of the culture. But I would say some of it is because of the amount of work that's involved in a computer science paper and just the complexity of the computational overhead. And so, yes, collaboration matters. I would say perhaps it matters just as much in terms of showing, it's interesting always when I see someone has collaborated with Luth AI and also has collaborated with with another group, because it shows also maturity in terms of being able to kind of navigate different collaboration groups. So that's interesting. But yeah, does anyone else have thoughts here? And then how does one who does not have a background in computer science get into research? I would say it's been said in many ways, but I would join, I would either join with the open science communities or explicitly start to reach out to researchers whose papers you admire and say, hey, if you have a background idea coming up, I'd love to get involved. Michael, I love it. Yeah, Michael says join Bird Session. I think that's a fantastic idea as well. So yeah. And with that, I think, this was such a really nice discussion. I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Madeline, for putting this together. And I really enjoyed this follow-up discussion as well. Yeah. Oh, thanks, Andreas. That was a clap so exuberant that it turned into a thumbs up. I always love it when that happens. Yeah, so really nice, everyone. And good to see everyone.